This is House Planning Help episode 84. Hi, I am Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to build new or to renovate. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up, I speak to Clare Parry, director of the Australian Passivhaus Association. Clare works on Passivhaus projects in a range of climates, so I'm hoping to understand what, if anything, changes. In other words, is the Passivhaus standard a good choice in all climates? And we'll actually start by thanking her, because she's done some other great things which I've been very appreciative of. You might know that I've been out in Australia, and I thought it'd be crying shame to go all that way on my family trip and spend a couple of months out there and not do at least one screening of The Future of Housing and How Air Tightness Can Help, which is the new documentary that House Planning Help produced in 2014. Luckily, Clare organised 2 screenings for us, and it wasn't until I met Clare that I discovered that she's in a very similar life stage to me. She's just started a family, so she did all this with a little one in tow, so total respect to her, super efficient, lovely person, as you're about to hear. We'll get stuck into that episode after we've heard this email, which sets a bit of context. It's from Gonzalo in Colombia. And I'll quickly say, Bienvenidos, Gonzalo. Gracias por escucharme. Oh dear, my Spanish is very rusty, and there might be the remnants of a Portuguese accent in there as well, completely mixed up. He says, I've listened to all your podcasts. It's been a pleasure to find such valuable information. Ben, it's clear to me that this is a podcast primarily for England, but it would be very interesting to know how a passive house would behave in a tropical climate with no seasons. Looking forward to listening to the next podcast. Kind regards, Gonzalo. So this question triggered off the episode on building to passive house standard in different climates. I'm not sure I fully get it myself, so that's the whole point. Clare does this all the time. She's the perfect person to answer a few of my questions. I started by asking her how she became interested in low energy buildings.
Well, I've always been interested in environmental sustainability, and I basically started out my career not really knowing how to get into that and not knowing what I wanted to do. Fell into building services engineering, and the rest is history. But I worked with some great people who've built some great buildings and pushed me into sustainability.
Today, I'm particularly interested in finding out more about passive house, but in terms of different climates, because we've talked about it a lot, and most of the time we're reflecting on the UK because that's where I'm based. A lot of our interviewees tend to come from there. Do you want to set the scene of you in Australia here first?
Yeah, I suppose here in Australia, a lot of people are doubtful about passive house and how effective it will be. The biggest uptake of passive house has been so far in places like Canberra and Tasmania, where it's noticeably colder, and we have probably closest to what you would call a European climate. The biggest inspiration we draw is from places like Mexico and Spain, and even Indonesia, where there's been a couple of passive house projects where we are trying to convince people that passive house does work in warm climates, and particularly well in hot and humid climates. And the Passive House Institute are doing a lot of work on that as well at the moment.
How many different climate zones are there in Australia, and also how are they defined?
I think broadly speaking, we generally use 4 climate zones in Australia. You can break it down into any number of climate zones based on minor differences, but basically we have cold temperate, warm temperate, hot and humid, or warm and hot and humid. And the major differences are basically temperature and humidity, and I believe humidity is probably one of the hardest ones we generally have to deal with. Anywhere from cold to warm really don't vary that much, and probably nowhere near as much as you'd probably find around the rest of the world, say Europe.
What is actually different? You have it in a different climate. What is changing?
The beauty of passive house is that nothing changes. So it is about basic physics.
Why are so many people saying, because I've had this too, in fact, you very kindly helped me organise a couple of events here in Australia, and there was one lady who I didn't get a chance to speak to, but she was saying, I don't quite think passive house works here, and she sounded like she knew her stuff. What is it she's thinking doesn't work?
Yeah, I think you're being kind. I think she was bitterly critical of passive house. And we do get a lot of people like that. And the thing is that Australians in particular, we've become so used to living indoor-outdoor lifestyles. So we like to have our houses that we basically throw the doors open and half the house is open to the outside for a lot of the year. But there are large proportions of the year, particularly in the southern states, where it's too cold, and a lot of the northern states where it's far too hot. And there are those great spaces in between where we have temperate climates where you can live that way for most of the year. But particularly in Melbourne and the southern states as well, where I'm from, we actually use 80% of our heating and cooling energy on heating, and most people find that surprising. And so, yeah, there is opposition because people believe that they might have short memories, but they believe that we do live comfortably, and the opposite is actually true for most people.
And I would agree with that there's something about experiencing it for yourself. And I know that you've only got a couple of certified buildings out here for people to be able to go to, and they're all over the place.
That's right. There's a building in Canberra, there's a building in rural Victoria, and another one in South Australia, about 50 kilometres out of Adelaide. So they're not readily accessible, and they're all very new. But what we're finding is we have a lot of expats from particularly Europe, some from Northern America. They come out here and they tell us that Australian homes are the coldest they've ever lived in, which is pretty horrible.
I'm just thinking to some of the homes that I've seen out here, and it's been a huge range, but one of them in particular had no insulation whatsoever. And I remember one interview that we did asking some questions about Florida, and our interviewee was saying, well, actually, because it's such a good temperature all year round, is that what a lot of these houses are focusing on, that they're thinking that the temperature is actually so amenable the whole year round that you don't need to go to these great lengths?
I think a lot of people think that, but I wouldn't be surprised if they actually thought about it on a day-to-day basis, that they would find themselves too cold or often too hot in their homes. And our building code only actually started requiring insulation in homes from the early 2000s, which is a fairly horrible thing because before that, what were we doing? And I think a lot of our housing stock reflects the fact that we were doing nothing, and a lot of those homes are terribly inefficient.
Now, when we're looking at the actual savings, does it get confusing that you can have a house that's too hot in the peak temperatures and then too cold in the winter? Can a passive house work across both of those, because you're really just talking about the envelope of the building?
Yeah, well, like we discussed just before, passive house is about basic physics, and insulating a building keeps out the heat. It also keeps in the heat. So in the winter, we're finding that we retain the heat where we want it, and in the summer, we keep it out where we want it as well. So we can definitely work across the extremes, and in a way, it's actually easier to achieve passive house in Australia because our temperature differential from the indoor temperature to the outside temperature is a lot less than, say, in northern Europe, where you may have temperatures outside down to minus 20, minus 30, and inside you're still trying to achieve 20. So you've got a temperature differential there that's very high.
And you've also done some work up in Southeast Asia, I think I'm right in saying. Yeah. So can you describe how the process differs from when you're doing something back in Melbourne? We know the physics is all the same, but what is actually different, or is it down to the client actually saying, I want this here?
In terms of what we do to make the building work, nothing really changes except that you will actually find that you don't actually need as much insulation because, like I said, the temperature differential doesn't change a lot. So, for example, in Jakarta, the outdoor temperature day on day is around 24 minimum to about 34 maximum. So
I think this is where I needed to pause and just let it sink into my brain. So you're saying it's more or less around the optimum temperature. So that's what people are perhaps arguing against, that they're saying, oh, well, I'm okay-ish, but there will always be one time in the year where it's suddenly cooler or...
Yeah, well, that's basically the answer, but passive house is based around comfort, and there are a lot more factors to comfort than just temperature. So we have humidity and airspeed and things like that, and radiant temperature. And for example, in Jakarta, the humidity is always very high, so we have discomfort even though the temperature isn't particularly high. So the solution over there is to control the amount of air that you have entering the building. So air tightness becomes critical, and the amount of air that you're introducing into the building is critical because you're at the same time that air is entering, humidity is entering, and you have problems like condensation if you do have the dew point being met where you do have condensation forming in the air or on surfaces, and people are very uncomfortable. So one thing we have to do over there is use mechanical systems that control humidity. So basically dehumidify the air. And that's where a lot of our energy is put into.
Can you explain those factors again? So all relative to the air tightness and the air that you're bringing inside. So
the comfort factors are temperature, radiant temperature, which is the temperature of your surfaces. So when we insulate the building, we're trying to control the temperature of the surfaces, which is the radiant temperature. Humidity and airspeed. So airspeed, if you have a fan in a room, for example, that will make you feel cooler, even though the temperature of the room isn't actually any different. You've talked about all those different factors. We know it's a comfort standard, but are they not seeing the financial savings that I would say in the UK, or you would, knowing that you've got a very cold period of the year? I think the cost savings are still there. Probably the problems we're seeing are more so in the southern states, where to achieve passive house in colder climates, we're doing things like using high standard double glazing or even triple glazing. And particularly these window units, because that's where we're seeing a lot of the additional cost for these homes. And the glazing that we're using is of a specification that we just can't find here in Australia, or that we're only beginning to find. So that's where our cost impact is. So we're either importing or using manufacturers that are doing something a bit more special so that they have a cost premium. So the cost benefit is still there, but it's taking longer to repay itself. So the payback is longer, and people are sort of shirking away from that initial capital costs that they have to meet. So do you have a personal goal here at all? You can obviously see sense in all of this. What are you hoping to do, or how do you see this will evolve? One of the major things we have to do is grow the industry, because that cost impact is something that people are just not really ever going to get over, because we just can't afford to spend, an extra 20-30% on our homes to make them energy efficient, when if they take up to 60 years, obviously, to pay back, that's never going to be an attractive proposition for anybody. So that's basically longer than the life of some homes. So growing the industry is critical. A lot of that is based around bringing in imports, unfortunately. The Australian manufacturing industry is small. There are people doing it. There are people manufacturing things like windows. The insulation industry is coming around. We have the local manufacturers starting to realise the importance of Passive House and starting to develop their insulation range. The air tightness products, they are coming in from overseas, but nonetheless they are coming in, and there are more and more of them all the time. Secondly to that, it's the building industry that we need to bring along for the ride. Having people that know what they're doing and knowing why what they're doing is important. And if a homeowner is listening at the moment, let's talk specifically about Australia, where can they go to find out more information and to go down this route? The Australian Passive House Association, we have a website. We are updating that all the time. We also hold events. We're available also to answer questions, take queries, convince people one way or the other that Passive House actually is a meaningful thing and that we should be doing it. And even for those people who don't want to do Passive House, they don't want to go the whole way, we're sort of selling a message that building efficiency is possible, and comfort and health are part of that package as well. Looking at the supply chain, you've already mentioned it a few moments ago. If these people decide to go down that route, can they easily achieve Passive House standard, or are we still in this growth stage where the expertise, the supply chain's not quite there yet? I believe that we can definitely achieve Passive House with the products available in Australia and the craftsmanship that we have here as well. I've personally worked on projects that have done just that. So there's nothing really holding us back. And the more people that do it, the easier it's going to be for the next project that comes along. And I'd say the growth in the activity of the standard in Australia is coming from the people who want it for their own projects. They're pulling along then the architects and the design team, who are then demanding more of the construction industry, and the demand then comes along for the supply chain. So it's coming along. Maybe you could use a couple of the examples of work that you do every day, because Elron Burrell, a good friend of mine, he tipped me off. He said, Claire does loads of interesting stuff, and it's not just in her local vicinity. So why are you working in different areas, and what are you up to? Well, the reason we work in different areas is because, as you may know, Australia is quite a large country. We're very spread out, and as such, the expertise is very spread out. So I have projects ranging from Hobart in Tasmania, right down south, up to Jakarta in Indonesia. So we have, just speaking specifically on passive house projects, one in Indonesia, that's a school. So looking at something like that, we have very interesting issues such as high occupancy levels. So we have quite dense occupation, so 25 people to a room. And as I mentioned, the humidity can be quite a large issue. So once you have the humidity and the heat being generated off people, you then have to deal with that as well as the outside air humidity that's coming in. So that presented some interesting issues on its own in terms of dealing with that in an efficient way. Then homes in hot but dry areas such as Victoria. We also get quite a cool to cold winter. Nothing like the UK, but we call it cold. But that we experience a very hot heat over summer and dry as well. Anything up to 40 degrees. So dealing with that was also quite interesting with trying not to introduce different mechanical systems, but trying to maintain an efficient and comfortable building. Then we have office buildings as well, which probably sit somewhere between homes and the school I mentioned, in that you have a bit more of an intensive occupation. You also have quite a high equipment load, which presents interesting issues with electrical loads. So, we have all sorts of different kinds of passive house projects: education, office, homes, others which are mixed use. So we have residential combined with a physiotherapy centre, which was interesting. It was a home-based office scenario. And it's probably important to note here that Passive House handles all of these, and it's still called Passive House. And a lot of people have the misconception that house in German translates to house in English. It doesn't quite work that way. So Passive House handles all of these projects and does so very successfully. Some of these projects are finished and the clients are extremely happy and extremely glad that they went down the route of Passive House.
Presumably you have some occupant feedback from these different areas. So do you find that it's all the same, or it's all different? How does that feedback compare, or is it just it's a passive house?
It does vary a lot. One of the things about something like a passive house, you do have to engage a little bit with a passive house to make it work correctly. So there is a little bit of occupant training, and as a result you often have a little bit of occupant error. If you leave the blinds up on a really hot day, your house will be baking and it will take a little bit longer to cool it down because it's a passive house and it's meant to retain that heat. So
how do we overcome that then?
It's user education, and I think the UK has gone through this process as well. I've read some studies about this that have come out of the UK. All the design process in the world can go into getting something right, but once you stick people in there, people are imperfect beings, and people just need to understand why something works the way it does. And once they know and once they understand, these things are very successful.
If we have this situation where we're going to be wanting solar gain in the winter, and then when we get to the hot months, we really don't want to have that in there, you can design the building so that you're going to really minimise that overheating.
That's right. So this is all about control. So knowing what your solar gain is. You basically, in Australia, you'll find that you're designing your home for summer. And you design it so that you also see some benefit in winter, but you really need to have that control. And that's probably going to be something that you manually or automatically adjust. So your home will be something that you need to engage with to make work. And that's how you're going to make it successful. So I don't believe that you can have an entirely passive home that will be comfortable and efficient the whole year round without engaging with it in some way.
Are there any other aspects of different climates that we should be looking at? You've talked about a lot of them already, but what else is missing from this discussion?
Like we talked about, there are some climates where people do live indoor-outdoor lives very successfully, and they are comfortable most of the year. And there probably are, sweet spots in Australia where passive house really isn't required. And I would probably agree with that on some fronts.
Has the research been done there? Because there must be an argument for certain climates where actually the temperature is good Okay, the windows, having them open, people are happy with that. But what happens for those few times that it gets too hot, or into the future when it might be? When the air conditioning is switched on, has that research been done as to how much energy are you really using? It may only be a handful of days, but do we get to the point where actually, if you'd done it properly in the first place, you could have had that control?
I think that you're onto something there. I would still say that in those instances, a well-designed home, which may not be a passive house home, but it would be a home that uses the principles of that standard. So you'd have something that was very well insulated to the right degree. You know, a passive house, I think people have this misconception that a passive house has a foot of insulation on it. That's not true for every climate zone. So you have something that's well insulated appropriately, that's airtight to a necessary standard. And you may or may not need something like mechanical ventilation, depending on how airtight you have made your home. You will achieve something that probably can be comfortable 100% of the year, particularly in those temperate climates.
And finally, a quick word. This may not be your area of expertise, knowing where you work, but if you got somewhere really, really cold, is one of the arguments for not going to full Passive House certified buildings that you would need such a lot of insulation that the law of diminishing returns just gets ridiculous?
I think the Passive House has done this research, the Passive House Institute, sorry. They've done this research and they've determined that there are, half a dozen spots around the world where Passive House, they just can't get it to work cost effectively. But there are Passive House buildings in Antarctica. So I don't think there's such a thing as too cold. The capital cost might be prohibitive, and the type of building you have may be such that it may not work effectively to ever have a good payback. So it might just be a money sink. But the beauty of Passive House is that the benchmark that has been established for where you do meet Passive House is set where the cost effectiveness is the best. So they've also determined that spending any more money is exactly what you said. You have diminishing returns and it's not a worthwhile equation.
Claire, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Every episode is always a learning experience, and we put the main points online in our show notes, or if you prefer, you can download the full transcript. houseplanninghelp.com/84 for this episode. We also try and complement the show notes with things that you can't do in audio, for example, photos. And there's a particular chart that I've put on there which actually has no relevance necessarily to the episode. But when I was chatting to Clare, she said that this research had been done. They took 20 sample houses in Melbourne and they tested for airtightness. And this chart, it made the UK look good. So I think you ought to go and check it out. It's in today's show notes. There are links to the Australian Passive House Association and to Clare. I have a lot of time for Clare. Lovely lass. houseplanninghelp.com/84. Let's do a few iTunes reviews to finish up on, and this one is from Strawhead in the UK. Great range of perspectives is the title. Really interesting and engaging series of interviews covering many different aspects of sustainable building, energy efficiency, self-build and more. Good to hear a range of perspectives from industry professionals to first-time self-builders. Thank you for that one. Great insights, says Property Investments UK. Brilliant podcast, great interviews, and really good insights into self-building and improving homes. A real inspiration if you are looking to take on your own self-build. And Nigel Banks, the title of this one, True Inspiration During My Commute. I only discovered the podcast a year ago and got through Ben's back catalogue very quickly. Listening to them on my way to work sets me up to think very differently. Truly inspirational interviews. I've missed them the past month, but I'm now enjoying all these Aussie episodes. And yes, I got to Australia fully intending to keep up the podcast every week, and it just didn't happen. There's too much sunshine out there. That's the trouble. Back here in the gloom. Don't worry, it's okay. We can be consistent again. Next time, environmental architect and doctoral researcher at UCL Energy Institute, Sophie Pelsmakers is my guest. We're going to be looking at 10 environmental design myths. I hope you can join me then.